The Mormon Deflection, Chapter 3, Book of Mormon and DNA Studies. For over a century and a half, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints didn't hedge. They didn't equivocate. They didn't speak in careful lawyered language about spiritual truths or metaphorical frameworks. They declared with absolute prophetic certainty that the Book of Mormon was literal history, real people, real battles, real civilizations that rose and fell on American soil. The Lamanites weren't symbolic. They were your neighbors. They were, according to the 1980 introduction to the Book of Mormon, the principal ancestors of the American Indians. Prophets taught it from the pulpit. Missionaries taught it door to door, sometimes to the very people they claimed were Lamanite descendants. Sunday school manuals presented Nephite civilizations as established fact, complete with timelines and maps. Spencer W. Kimball, speaking as a prophet of God, looked into the faces of Native Americans and called them Lamanites, promised them that as they embraced the gospel they would become white and delightsome, a phrase later quietly amended to pure and delightsome when the racism became too obvious to ignore. The church didn't just believe the Book of Mormon was true. They staked their entire theological foundation on its historical accuracy. Then DNA science matured, and everything changed. Not all at once. Not with a dramatic announcement or a prophet standing at a pulpit admitting error. The church's certainty evaporated the way institutional lies always do, quietly, incrementally, through carefully worded revisions that appear in new editions without fanfare or explanation. The 1980 introduction said principal ancestors. The 2006 introduction said among the ancestors. One word. One small preposition that represents a theological retreat of staggering proportions. Members noticed. Online forums erupted with questions. Why the change? What happened? The church offered no explanation, no acknowledgement that anything had shifted at all. They simply moved forward as if they had always held this more modest claim, as if the previous 150 years of absolute certainty had never occurred. By the time the church published its Gospel Topics essay on DNA in the Book of Mormon, the damage control was already in full swing. The essay opens with a statement so carefully constructed, so meticulously hedged, that it deserves to be examined word by word. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints affirms that the Book of Mormon is a volume of sacred scripture comparable to the Bible. It contains a record of God's dealings with three groups of people who migrated from the Near East or West Asia to the Americas hundreds of years before the arrival of Europeans. Three groups. The church can't even accurately represent its own scripture. The Book of Mormon deals with four distinct groups of people, not three. There are the Jaredites, who according to the narrative arrived around 2200 BCE, emerging from the Tower of Babel and crossing the ocean in sealed barges lit by glowing stones. They built a civilization, warred among themselves, and supposedly destroyed each other entirely before the Nephites ever arrived. Then came the Mulekites around 589 BCE, fleeing Jerusalem's destruction and establishing settlements of their own. Around 600 BCE came Lehi's family, the group that split into Nephites and Lamanites, brothers who became warring factions, one blessed with light skin, the other cursed with dark skin as a mark of God's displeasure. These aren't minor background details. These are central pillars of the Book of Mormon's narrative. The Jaredites allegedly built massive civilizations, complete with metallurgy and complex social structures. The Mulekites merged with the Nephites and became part of the story. And the Nephite-Lamanite conflict forms the emotional and theological core of the entire book, culminating in apocalyptic battles that left hundreds of thousands dead. So why does the church's own essay reduce this to three groups? Because acknowledging four distinct migrations, each requiring its own explanation for why DNA evidence doesn't support it, makes the problem exponentially worse. It's easier to blur the details, to speak vaguely of groups and migrations, than to defend the specific, falsifiable claims the Book of Mormon actually makes. The essay continues with even more revealing language. Although the primary purpose of the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical, some people have wondered whether the migrations it describes are compatible with scientific studies of ancient America. Read that again. More spiritual than historical. This from an institution that spent generations declaring it to be literal history. Joseph Smith didn't present the Book of Mormon as spiritual allegory. He said he translated it from gold plates shown to him by an angel, plates that contained an actual historical record of actual people. Early church leaders didn't treat Lamanites as metaphors. They pointed to living Native Americans and declared them to be literal descendants of Book of Mormon peoples. The church established programs to place Native American children in white Mormon homes, believing they could quite literally breed the darkness out of them through righteous living and intermarriage. Now, faced with scientific evidence that demolishes these claims, the church suddenly discovers that the Book of Mormon was more spiritual than historical all along. When the truth claims of your scripture can be tested and proven false, you don't get to retroactively reframe them as metaphor. That's not how truth works. The essay then moves to dismiss the scientific consensus outright. Basic principles of population genetics suggest the need for a more careful approach to the data. The conclusions of genetics, like those of any science, are tentative, and much work remains to be done to fully understand the origins of the native populations of the Americas. This is where the church's dishonesty becomes brazen. The science is not tentative. The conclusions are not uncertain. The overwhelming consensus in the scientific community, built on decades of rigorous research, peer review, and replication, confirms that Native Americans descend from populations originating in Siberia and Mongolia. These migrations occurred over 15,000 years ago, during the last ice age, when falling sea levels exposed the Bering Land Bridge and allowed human populations to cross from Asia into the Americas. This isn't speculation. This isn't a theory waiting for better evidence. This is established scientific fact, supported by multiple independent lines of evidence that all point to the same conclusion. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, has been meticulously analyzed across Native American populations and compared to both ancient and modern Eurasian populations. Y chromosome markers, passed from father to son, tell the same story. Archaeological evidence traces human habitation across the Americas back tens of thousands of years. Linguistic analysis shows connections between Native American languages and ancient Asian language families. Geological data confirms when and how the land bridge existed. The genetic markers are unambiguous. Native American populations overwhelmingly belong to mitochondrial haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X. These exact haplogroups are found in Siberian and East Asian populations. When geneticists analyzed ancient remains from Siberia and compared them to Native American DNA, they found clear genetic continuity. The populations match, the timeline matches, the migration routes match. Everything fits together into a coherent picture that has been confirmed by thousands of studies across multiple scientific disciplines. Here's what that means in practical terms. If Book of Mormon peoples existed, if Lehi's family, the Jaredites, the Mulekites, actually migrated from the Near East to the Americas, we would find Near Eastern Y chromosome and mitochondrial haplogroups intermixed with Native American populations. We would see the genetic signature of Middle Eastern ancestry woven through indigenous DNA, just as we see it in every other documented migration in human history. We don't. Not a trace. Haplogroup X, often seized upon by fringe theorists and Mormon apologists who desperately want to find European ancestry in Native Americans, doesn't provide the escape hatch they're looking for. Haplogroup X2A, the specific subclade found in some Native American populations, traces back to ancient Siberians, not Europeans. It arrived in the Americas through the same Beringian migration as the other haplogroups, just at a different time or through a different wave of migration. No European connection exists in the pre-Columbian Americas. Y chromosome data from Native American males tells the same story. The vast majority belong to haplogroup Q, common in Siberian and Mongolian populations. This isn't a matter of incomplete data or limited sampling. Tens of thousands of Native Americans have been tested. Ancient DNA has been extracted from remains thousands of years old. The signal is consistent, clear, and unambiguous. Native Americans came from Siberia, period. Dr. Michael Crawford, a renowned expert in biological anthropology and genetics, states it plainly. The genetic data unequivocally supports the idea that the initial peopling of the Americas came from Siberia. That's not hedging. That's not uncertainty. That's scientific consensus based on overwhelming evidence. And what about Near Eastern DNA? What about the genetic markers that should exist if Lehi's family, or the Jaredites, or the Mulekites actually migrated from the Middle East to the Americas? They're absent. Completely, utterly absent. Not hard to detect. Not possibly obscured by later migrations. Absent. No trace of Near Eastern genetic markers has ever been found in pre-Columbian Native American populations. Not in ancient remains. Not in isolated populations that had limited contact with Europeans. Not anywhere. The Church knows this. They must know this. They have scientists among their membership, geneticists who understand exactly what the evidence shows, which makes their response even more troubling. Rather than acknowledge the evidence, they resort to misdirection and obfuscation. They claim the data is tentative. They suggest that much work remains to be done. They create the impression that scientists are still puzzling over the origins of Native Americans, as if this were some great unsolved mystery of anthropology. It's not. The mystery was solved. Native Americans came from Asia. The DNA evidence is decisive, and it leaves no room for Book of Mormon populations from the Near East. The Church's evasions faced with evidence they cannot refute, the Church pivots to its final line of defense. Nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples, and even if their genetic profile were known, there are sound scientific reasons that it might remain undetected. This statement is crafted to sound reasonable, to suggest that there's simply too much uncertainty to draw conclusions. But it's a deflection, and a dishonest one. Yes, we don't know the exact genetic profile of Lehi or Sariah or any specific individual from the Book of Mormon. But that's irrelevant. If these people existed, if they migrated from the Near East to the Americas, if they established civilizations and had descendants who survived to become ancestors of modern Native Americans, then their DNA would be detectable today. Not perfectly preserved, not unmixed, but detectable. The Church vaguely gestures toward population bottlenecks and genetic drift as explanations for why Book of Mormon DNA might have vanished without a trace. Let's examine these claims carefully, because this is where the Church's argument collapses entirely under the weight of its own logic. A population bottleneck occurs when a population is dramatically reduced in size, leaving only a small number of individuals to pass on their genes to future generations. Bottlenecks can reduce genetic diversity and cause certain genetic markers to become more or less common in subsequent populations. Genetic drift refers to random changes in gene frequencies that occur in small populations over time. The Church wants you to believe that these processes somehow erased all trace of Near Eastern DNA from Native American populations. Here's why that's impossible. Bottlenecks and genetic drift don't selectively erase some DNA while preserving other, far older DNA. Geneticists have identified bottlenecks in Native American populations dating back over 20,000 years to the Paleolithic period when Siberian populations first crossed into the Americas. Those ancient bottlenecks didn't erase the Siberian genetic signature. We can still detect it clearly today. The genetic markers from those original migrations persist, identifiable and traceable, despite tens of thousands of years of population fluctuations, migrations, bottlenecks, and drift. So explain to me how a bottleneck could erase DNA from Book of Mormon peoples who allegedly arrived only 2,600 years ago, while simultaneously preserving DNA from Siberian peoples who arrived 20,000 years ago. The Church inadvertently exposes this problem in their own essay when they write, "A 2014 study indicates that as much as 1/3 of Native American DNA may have originated anciently in Europe or West Asia. From this evidence, scientists conclude that some Europeans or West Asians migrated eastward across Asia, mixing with a group that eventually migrated to the Americas millennia before the events described in the Book of Mormon." Read that carefully. A migration from Europe or West Asia that occurred over 20,000 years ago, millennia before Book of Mormon events, remains detectable in Native American DNA today. We can follow the genetic trail of these ancient peoples as they moved eastward across Siberia, mixed with other populations, and eventually crossed into the Americas. Their genetic markers survived 20,000 years of population bottlenecks, genetic drift, and mixing with other populations. They survived the harsh conditions of Ice Age migrations. They survived the Beringian crossing. They survived the dispersal across 2 continents, and they remain detectable in modern Native American populations. But somehow, according to the Church, we cannot detect DNA from peoples who arrived 2,600 years ago. This is the contradiction the Church cannot escape. Ancient DNA survives. Recent DNA vanishes. The Church is asking you to believe that genetic markers from 20,000 years ago are clearer than markers from 2,600 years ago. They're asking you to accept that the laws of genetics work backwards, that time makes DNA more detectable rather than less. This isn't a gap in scientific knowledge. This is the Church hoping you won't notice that their explanation contradicts itself. The founder effect. The Church attempts another defense, claiming that the founder effect explains why Near Eastern DNA might be undetectable. Nothing is known about the DNA that Lehi, Sariah, Ishmael, and others brought to the Americas. Even if geneticists had a database of the DNA that now exists among all modern American Indian groups, it would be impossible to know exactly what to search for. The founder effect occurs when a small group splits off from a larger population and establishes a new population, carrying only a subset of the genetic diversity of the original population. The Church suggests that because we don't know exactly which genetic markers Lehi's family carried, we might not know what to search for in modern populations. This argument might sound plausible if you don't understand genetics, but it falls apart immediately under scrutiny. We don't need to know Lehi's exact genetic profile to detect Near Eastern ancestry in Native Americans. Geneticists don't search for individuals. They search for population-level markers, haplogroups, and genetic signatures that indicate geographic ancestry. If Book of Mormon peoples came from the Near East, they would carry Near Eastern haplogroups. Those haplogroups would be detectable even if significantly diluted through mixing with other populations. Let's look at real-world examples of small migrations that left detectable genetic traces. The Beta Israel Ethiopian Jews, who were isolated from other Jewish populations for over 2,000 years, still carry detectable Middle Eastern genetic markers despite centuries of mixing with African populations. The Kalash people of Pakistan, isolated in mountain valleys for millennia, retain genetic links to ancient European populations that remain identifiable today. Sephardic Jews who migrated to the Americas 500 years ago, far more recently than Book of Mormon peoples, left distinct genetic markers that can still be identified in their descendants despite extensive mixing with European and Native American populations. Then there's the perfect counterexample that demolishes the Church's entire argument. Dr. Ugo A. Perego, a Latter-day Saint population geneticist who has studied this issue extensively. Dr. Perego is Italian, born in Italy to Italian parents. Yet when his DNA was analyzed, his paternal lineage traces to haplogroup C, an Asian Native American haplogroup. Despite generations of his family living in Europe, the genetic signature of an ancient migration from Asia to Europe remains detectable in his DNA. Nothing is known about the DNA that Lehi, Sariah, Ishmael, and others brought to the Americas. Even if geneticists had a database of the DNA that now exists among all modern American Indian groups, it would be impossible to know exactly what to search for. Yet it remains detectable, clear, identifiable, traceable. If a single ancient migration from Asia to Europe left genetic traces that survived for millennia, why would a migration from the Near East to the Americas 20,600 years ago leave nothing? The Book of Mormon doesn't describe a single family quietly assimilating into existing populations and vanishing without a trace. It describes multiple migrations, distinct groups establishing civilizations, populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The final battle at Cumorah allegedly involved Nephite armies that had fielded 230,000 soldiers. Even if we assume massive exaggeration in the text, we're still talking about substantial populations. Where is their DNA? Where are the genetic markers that should exist if these populations were real? The founder effect doesn't erase genetic signatures, it concentrates them. Small founding populations create genetic bottlenecks that make certain markers more prevalent, not less detectable. If anything, the founder effect should make Book of Mormon DNA easier to find, not harder. The Church knows this. Dr. Perego knows this. He has published research on this very topic. Yet the Church continues to suggest that founder effects, bottlenecks, and drift somehow explain the complete absence of Near Eastern genetic markers in Native Americans. The limited geography defense. As DNA evidence has mounted, Mormon apologists have increasingly retreated to what they call the limited geography model. This theory claims that all Book of Mormon events occurred in a small geographic region, probably Mesoamerica, and that Lehi's group was small and quickly absorbed into existing Native American populations. This way, apologists can claim the Book of Mormon is still historically accurate while explaining why we can't find any supporting evidence. There's just one problem. The Book of Mormon itself contradicts this theory at every turn. The text repeatedly refers to the whole face of the land, describes civilizations spreading across vast territories, and depicts migrations that span from the land northward to the land southward with narrow passages between them. These aren't descriptions of a limited region in Mesoamerica. These are descriptions of continental-scale geography. When the Book of Mormon describes the Jaredites' final battle, it claims that the whole face of the land was covered with bodies. When it describes the Nephite dispersion, it speaks of populations spreading across the land from sea to sea. The climactic battle at Cumorah, where the Nephites made their last stand, allegedly involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers and left the hill covered with the corpses of the slain. Mormon, the prophet general compiling the record, describes gathering and burying the dead, watching as his entire civilization was systematically destroyed. This wasn't a skirmish between small tribes in a limited region. This was an apocalyptic civilizational collapse on a massive scale. And yet archaeologists have found nothing at the Hill Cumorah in New York. No weapons, no armor, no bones, no evidence of any battle, let alone one involving hundreds of thousands of people. The limited geography model tries to relocate Cumorah to Mesoamerica, claiming the Hill Cumorah in New York was just named by early Mormons and isn't the actual site. But this creates its own problems, because the Book of Mormon describes Mormon's son Moroni traveling from the final battle to bury the gold plates in the Hill Cumorah, the same hill where Joseph Smith later found them in New York. You can't have it both ways. Either the Hill Cumorah in New York is the site of the final battle, in which case there should be massive archaeological evidence that doesn't exist, or it's not, in which case Moroni somehow traveled thousands of miles from Mesoamerica to New York to bury the plates, and the entire geography of the Book of Mormon makes no sense. But here's what matters most. The limited geography model isn't found in the Book of Mormon text. It's not found in Joseph Smith's teachings. It's not found in the teachings of Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, or any church president for the first 150 years of Mormon history. Joseph Smith explicitly identified the Hill Cumorah in New York as the site of the final battle. He identified the Mississippi River Valley as Nephite territory. He declared that Zelph, a skeleton discovered in Illinois, was a white Lamanite who died in the final battles. Early church leaders spoke of Book of Mormon geography spanning from South America to New York. The limited geography model was invented by modern apologists who needed a way to reconcile scientific evidence with Scripture. And it does so by simply ignoring what the Scripture actually says and what church founders taught. When your claims are proven false, you don't acknowledge error. You quietly redefine what you were claiming all along. For 150 years, the church taught that Lamanites were the principal ancestors of all Native Americans, that the Book of Mormon described the entire Western Hemisphere, that Native Americans were literally the remnant of Book of Mormon peoples. Now, faced with evidence that proves those claims false, apologists retreat to, well, maybe it was just a small group in a small area, as if that's what they meant all along. It's not what they meant, and the evidence still doesn't support even this diminished claim. The archaeological void DNA evidence isn't the only problem for the Book of Mormon's historicity. There's also the complete absence of archaeological evidence supporting any of its claims, not ambiguous evidence that could be interpreted multiple ways. Not disputed evidence where experts disagree, no evidence at all, The Book of Mormon describes advanced civilizations with large populations, extensive agriculture, complex metallurgy, and written languages. It mentions horses, cattle, sheep, goats, elephants, wheat, barley, and steel. It describes swords, shields, breastplates, coins, and chariots. It depicts cities with temples, fortifications, and roads. These aren't vague spiritual metaphors. These are concrete, material claims about the physical world. And archaeologists have found exactly none of it. No Nephite cities, no Lamanite temples, no Jaredite barges, no reformed Egyptian inscriptions, no Hebrew artifacts, no metallurgical evidence of steel production, no remains of horses or cattle or any of the other animals mentioned in the text, no wheat or barley remains in sites predating European contact. Nothing. This isn't a case of evidence being hard to find or ambiguous. We have extensive archaeological records from ancient Mesoamerica and South America. We know what civilizations existed there, what they built, what languages they spoke, what crops they grew, what animals they domesticated. The archaeological record is rich and detailed. We've deciphered Mayan hieroglyphics. We've mapped Aztec cities. We've traced the spread of agriculture across the continents. We've identified trade networks, religious practices, political structures, and nothing, absolutely nothing, corresponds to the Book of Mormon's descriptions. The civilizations that actually existed in ancient America don't match Book of Mormon civilizations. The languages don't match. The material culture doesn't match. The timeline doesn't match. The agriculture doesn't match. The animals don't match. Compare this to other ancient civilizations. We have abundant archaeological evidence for ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China. We've excavated their cities, deciphered their writing systems, analyzed their trade goods, mapped their empires. We've found the mundane detritus of daily life, broken pottery, discarded tools, trash heaps, alongside monumental architecture. The archaeological record for these civilizations is so extensive that we can reconstruct details of how ordinary people lived, what they ate, how they dressed, what they believed. The Book of Mormon describes civilizations that should have left similar evidence. Populations in the hundreds of thousands don't vanish without a trace. Cities don't disappear entirely. Metallurgy leaves chemical signatures in the soil. Writing systems leave inscriptions. Warfare leaves weapons and fortifications. Agricultural practices leave ecological impacts. Yet for Book of Mormon civilizations, we have nothing. Mormon archaeologists haven't been sitting idle. They've searched desperately, motivated by genuine faith and a sincere desire to vindicate their scripture. Organizations like Book of Mormon Archaeological Forum have spent decades looking for evidence. They've surveyed sites across Mesoamerica. They've studied ruins, analyzed artifacts, compared geographical features to Book of Mormon descriptions, and they've found nothing that uniquely supports the Book of Mormon's claims. Every archaeological discovery in the Americas either predates Book of Mormon civilizations by thousands of years or postdates them and can be attributed to known historical cultures. There's no gap in the archaeological record where Nephite or Lamanite civilizations should exist. The timeline of human habitation in the Americas is well established and continuous, showing clear cultural development from Paleo-Indian populations through various pre-Columbian civilizations to European contact. Book of Mormon civilizations don't fit anywhere in this timeline. The Smithsonian Institution, which receives frequent inquiries about Book of Mormon archaeology, has repeatedly issued statements making clear that it sees no archaeological evidence supporting the Book of Mormon's historical claims. The National Geographic Society has issued similar statements. These aren't anti-Mormon organizations with an axe to grind. They're scientific institutions responding to the evidence, or rather to the absence of evidence. And in archaeology, absence of evidence absolutely is evidence of absence. When we're talking about large populations, complex civilizations, and widespread use of material culture. You can't have cities without ruins. You can't have agriculture without ecological impact. You can't have metallurgy without chemical traces. You can't have writing without inscriptions. You can't have hundreds of thousands of people without leaving archaeological evidence. Unless they never existed at all, the inconclusive evidence lie. The Church's final retreat is to claim that the evidence is simply inconclusive. The essay states, much as critics and defenders of the Book of Mormon would like to use DNA studies to support their views, The evidence is simply inconclusive. Nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples. Then Elder Dallin H. Oaks delivers the killing blow. It is our position that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. This statement is designed to sound humble, to position the Church as taking a measured, reasonable stance that respects the limits of scientific knowledge. But it's actually one of the most intellectually dishonest claims in the entire essay. Let's examine why. DNA evidence is among the most reliable forms of evidence we have in modern science. Courts of law use it to convict murderers and exonerate the wrongly imprisoned. Medicine uses it to diagnose diseases and develop treatments. Anthropology uses it to trace human migrations across continents and millennia. The same DNA evidence that can identify a crime suspect from a single hair can trace population movements from 20,000 years ago. When DNA evidence places a defendant at a crime scene, we don't say the evidence is inconclusive. When DNA evidence proves a man on death row is innocent, we don't dismiss it as secular evidence that can neither prove nor disprove his guilt. We treat DNA evidence as definitive because it is definitive. The science is sound, the methodology is rigorous, the results are replicable. But when that same DNA evidence contradicts the Book of Mormon, suddenly it becomes unreliable. Suddenly, we need to be more careful in our approach. Suddenly, the conclusions are tentative. This isn't scientific skepticism, it's motivated reasoning. The Church accepts DNA evidence in every context except the one where it proves them wrong. Elder Oaks' statement that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon is particularly insidious because it sounds like an epistemological principle when it's actually a rhetorical shield. Of course, secular evidence can disprove historical claims. That's what evidence does. That's what it's for. If I claim that Napoleon fought the Battle of Waterloo in China, historical evidence proves me wrong. If I claim that humans built cities on the moon in 1823, archaeological evidence proves me wrong. If I claim that millions of Near Eastern people migrated to the Americas and established civilizations, genetic and archaeological evidence proves me wrong. The Church wants to place the Book of Mormon in a special category where evidence doesn't matter, where empirical investigation is somehow inappropriate. But they didn't always hold this position. When they thought the evidence supported them, they happily cited it. When they believed Native Americans were Lamanites, they pointed to them as living proof of the Book of Mormon's truth. When they thought ancient ruins in Mesoamerica might be Nephite cities, they suggested connections. Only now, when the evidence decisively contradicts their claims, do they suddenly discover that evidence is irrelevant to spiritual truth. This is the same tactic used by young Earth creationists who claim the Earth is 6,000 years old, despite overwhelming geological, biological, and cosmological evidence to the contrary. When confronted with evidence, they retreat to secular evidence can't disprove the Bible. It's the same tactic used by flat earthers who dismiss photographs from space. It's the same tactic used by climate change deniers who wave away decades of data. When evidence contradicts your beliefs, you don't get to simply declare that evidence doesn't matter. The Church's claim that DNA evidence is inconclusive is particularly galling because the evidence isn't inconclusive at all. It's conclusive. It conclusively shows that Native Americans descend from Asian populations. It conclusively shows that no Near Eastern genetic markers exist in pre-Columbian Native American populations. It conclusively shows that the Book of Mormon's historical claims are false. Inconclusive would mean the evidence is ambiguous, that it could be interpreted multiple ways, that reasonable experts disagree about what it shows. But there's no ambiguity here. Geneticists don't disagree about the Asian origins of Native Americans. Anthropologists don't debate whether Near Eastern populations migrated to pre-Columbian America. The scientific consensus is clear, overwhelming, and based on mountains of evidence from multiple independent sources. The Church is not presenting a nuanced view of uncertain science. They're deliberately misrepresenting established scientific consensus to protect their truth claims. And they're hoping you won't notice the difference. The human cost. I need to be clear about something before we go further. This chapter isn't an attack on Latter-day Saints as people. The members of this church are by and large good people trying to live meaningful lives according to what they've been taught. They're your neighbors, your co-workers, your friends. Many are kind, generous, and sincere in their faith. This critique is aimed squarely at the institution, at the leaders who know better, at the carefully constructed deceptions, at the apparatus of control that prioritizes institutional preservation over honesty. Behind every DNA study, every archaeological survey, every genetic analysis, there are real people whose lives have been shaped by the Book of Mormon's claims. There are missionaries who spent 2 years teaching Native Americans that they were Lamanites, only to discover in a college genetics course that everything they taught was false. There are seminary teachers who built their entire understanding of ancient American history on Book of Mormon narratives, only to face the devastating realization that none of it was real. There are lifelong members who felt the first tremors of doubt when they learned about DNA evidence and made the mistake of investigating further. They read the church's Gospel Topics essay expecting reassurance and found only evasions. They asked leaders for clarification and received only testimony. They searched for answers and found a community of former members who aimed questions and received the same non-answers. The discovery that the Book of Mormon is fiction isn't just an intellectual adjustment. For many, it's an identity-shattering crisis that reverberates through every aspect of their lives. The Book of Mormon isn't just another book to believing Latter-day Saints. It's the keystone of their entire faith. Joseph Smith himself said that a man would get nearer to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book. If the Book of Mormon falls, everything falls with it. Families have split over this evidence. Marriages have ended. Parents have disowned children. Friendships have dissolved. People have lost their communities, their support systems, their sense of identity and purpose. And through it all, the church offers nothing but more carefully worded deflections, telling members that the evidence is inconclusive, that faith should triumph over evidence, that doubts come from Satan. These aren't abstract theological debates. These are people's lives, and they deserve better than carefully crafted deflections and epistemological shell games. Conclusion: the evidence speaks. The absence of Near Eastern genetic markers in Native American populations is not a mystery awaiting solution. It is not a gap in our knowledge that future research might fill. It is not inconclusive evidence that could go either way. It is an answer, clear, definitive, and devastating to the Book of Mormon's historical claims. DNA evidence has placed suspects at crime scenes with near certainty. It has identified remains thousands of years old. It has traced human migrations across continents and millennia. It has reunited families separated by war and genocide. It has exonerated the innocent and convicted the guilty. Courts rely on it. Medicine relies on it. Science relies on it. We trust DNA evidence with people's lives, with their freedom, with their futures. Yet when this same evidence contradicts the Book of Mormon, suddenly it becomes unreliable. Suddenly, scientific certainty becomes scientific speculation. Suddenly, the most reliable forensic tool in modern history cannot be trusted. The Book of Mormon describes Near Eastern peoples migrating to the Americas, establishing civilizations, fighting wars, and becoming the ancestors of Native American populations. If these events occurred, the genetic evidence would show it. We can trace ancient migrations from 20,000 years ago. We can identify population mixing across continents. We can detect genetic signatures from small founder populations that mixed with larger groups millennia in the past. But we find no trace of Near Eastern DNA in Native Americans. None in pre-Columbian remains. None in isolated populations. None anywhere. The genetic evidence doesn't show what the Book of Mormon claims. It shows the opposite. It shows that Native Americans descend from Asian populations who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age, exactly as mainstream science has long established. The archaeological evidence tells the same story. No Nephite cities, no Lamanite temples, no Jaredite artifacts, no horses, no cattle, no wheat, no steel, no Hebrew inscriptions, no reformed Egyptian texts, nothing. The civilizations described in the Book of Mormon didn't exist. The peoples described in the Book of Mormon didn't exist. The migrations described in the Book of Mormon didn't occur. Elder Oaks claims that secular evidence cannot disprove the Book of Mormon's authenticity. But evidence is precisely how we disprove historical claims. That's what evidence does. That's what it's for. When claims about the physical world can be tested against physical evidence and proven false, we don't call the evidence inconclusive. We call the claims false. The Book of Mormon is false. Not metaphorically false, not spiritually false, while historically ambiguous. Demonstrably, scientifically, conclusively false. The DNA evidence proves it. The archaeological evidence proves it. The linguistic evidence proves it. The anachronisms prove it. Every line of empirical investigation reaches the same inescapable conclusion, and the Church knows it. They must know it. The carefully hedged language in their Gospel Topics essay isn't the product of honest uncertainty. It's the product of institutional damage control. Every word has been weighed, every claim calibrated to create maximum ambiguity while admitting minimum error. They changed principal ancestors to among the ancestors, hoping members wouldn't notice the theological earthquake that single word represents. They reframed the Book of Mormon as more spiritual than historical, hoping members would forget the 150 years of prophets who taught it as literal history. This is what institutions do when they've been caught in a lie. They don't apologize. They don't acknowledge error. They quietly revise their claims and pretend they always held the revised position. They appeal to scientific uncertainty where none exists. They create false equivalences between overwhelming evidence and fringe speculation. They tell their members that faith means believing despite evidence, that doubt is a moral failing, that questions come from Satan. The pattern extends far beyond DNA evidence. It's visible in every Gospel Topics essay the Church has published. When confronted with Joseph Smith's polygamy and polyandry, they admit just enough to seem honest, while obscuring the most disturbing details. When confronted with the Book of Abraham papyri, they retreat to inspired translation rather than actual translation. When confronted with racism in church doctrine, they disavow past teachings, while refusing to acknowledge they came from prophets claiming to speak for God. Every essay follows the same playbook: minimize falsifiable claims, reframe historical assertions as spiritual truths, place the burden of faith on members rather than the burden of honesty on the institution. The DNA essay is simply the most scientifically devastating example of this pattern. Unlike theological questions that can be endlessly debated, DNA evidence provides clear, testable, falsifiable claims. Either Near Eastern genetic markers exist in Native American populations or they don't. Either the Bering Strait migration theory is supported by evidence or it isn't. Either we can trace ancient population movements through genetic analysis or we can't. The evidence answers all these questions definitively, and the answers contradict every historical claim the Book of Mormon makes about ancient America. This matters because the Church has built its entire theological edifice on the Book of Mormon's historicity. If the Book of Mormon is fiction, then Joseph Smith didn't translate ancient records. He wrote a 19th century novel and claimed divine authority for it. If Joseph Smith lied about the Book of Mormon, why should we trust his claims about revelations, priesthood authority, or temple ordinances? If the foundational narrative is false, what remains? The Church understands these stakes, which is why they fight so desperately to maintain ambiguity around the Book of Mormon's historicity. They can't afford to admit it's fiction because the entire structure collapses without it, so instead they gaslight their members, telling them the evidence is inconclusive when it's actually decisive, telling them science is uncertain when scientific consensus is overwhelming, telling them to choose faith over evidence as if that's a virtue rather than intellectual capitulation. But evidence doesn't care about faith. Truth doesn't bend to institutional needs. Reality doesn't reshape itself to accommodate religious claims. The DNA evidence exists, the archaeological record exists, the scientific consensus exists, and no amount of careful hedging in Gospel Topics essays can change what the evidence shows. Native Americans descend from Asian populations who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age. This is established scientific fact, supported by genetics, archaeology, linguistics, and geology. No Near Eastern populations migrated to the Americas in pre-Columbian times. No Nephites built cities. No Lamanites fought wars. No Jaredites crossed oceans in sealed barges. These peoples existed only in Joseph Smith's imagination, and the evidence proves it beyond any reasonable doubt. The Church can continue to claim the evidence is inconclusive. They can continue to suggest that future research might vindicate their claims. They can continue to tell members that faith should triumph over evidence. But none of this changes the fundamental reality that the Book of Mormon's historical claims are false, demonstrably false, and that the institution knows it. For members discovering this evidence, the path forward is painful but necessary. The Church has shown it will not acknowledge error, will not apologize for false teachings, will not treat its members as deserving of honesty and transparency. It will continue to reframe claims and shift position rather than admit the truth. You deserve better. You deserve an institution that values truth over institutional preservation. You deserve leaders who acknowledge when they're wrong rather than doubling down on carefully constructed evasions. You deserve a faith that can withstand scrutiny rather than one that demands you ignore evidence. The DNA evidence isn't inconclusive. The Book of Mormon isn't more spiritual than historical. Joseph Smith didn't translate ancient records. These aren't matters of interpretation or faith. They're matters of fact, and the facts are clear. The question isn't whether the evidence disproves the Book of Mormon's historicity. It does. The question is whether you'll accept what the evidence shows, or whether you'll join the Church in pretending that ambiguity exists where none does. The choice is yours. But the evidence speaks for itself, and it speaks with absolute clarity. The Book of Mormon is not an ancient record. It is a 19th century creation, and no amount of faithful reinterpretation can change that fundamental truth.